The ice on the windows of the Sterling Heights corporate plaza didn't just reflect the festive lights of the city. It felt like a cold, jagged mirror of my own life. It was December 23rd, the day the world was supposed to slow down, find warmth in the glow of family, and celebrate the closing of another year. But for me, the air in the boardroom was thinner than the frost outside. I stood there, clutching a simple cardboard box containing 5 years of my life, my favorite coffee mug, a framed photo of my late mother, and a stack of performance reviews that all said the same thing: exemplary. Yet, across the mahogany table sat Marcus Thorne, the man I had helped build this empire from the ground up. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his gold watch, tapping his fingers impatiently, as if my presence was an inconvenient delay to his holiday gala. Beside him sat Chloe, his niece, a woman whose only contribution to the firm was her ability to spend company capital on designer handbags. She was smiling, a sharp, predatory grin that told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just letting me go because of restructuring, as the official document claimed. They were purging me because I knew too much about the creative accounting that funded their lavish lifestyle. They were firing me 2 days before Christmas, stripping away my health insurance, my year-end bonus, and my dignity, all while the lobby downstairs echoed with the cheerful sounds of "Joy to the World." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes devoid of any warmth. He told me that my services were no longer required, effective immediately. He didn't thank me for the late nights, the lost weekends, or the fact that I had saved the company from a federal audit just 6 months prior. Instead, he signaled for security. The humiliation was calculated. He wanted me to be marched through the office, past the desks of colleagues I had mentored, while the tinsel hung mockingly from the ceiling. Chloe leaned forward, her voice a poisonous whisper, telling me to enjoy my holiday break and suggesting that perhaps I could find work gift wrapping at the mall. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and for a moment, the world went silent. The betrayal burned, a hot, searing coal in my chest, but as the security guard placed a hand on my shoulder, something shifted. They saw a broken woman, a disposable employee, cast out into the winter storm. What they didn't see was the flash drive tucked safely in my velvet coat pocket, a digital skeleton key to every dark secret Thorne Enterprises had tried to bury. They thought they were ending my career, but they were actually giving me the one thing I needed most: a reason to destroy them. As I walked out into the biting wind of Manhattan, the snow began to fall in heavy, silent flakes. My breath hitched in the cold, but I didn't cry. I walked 3 blocks to a small, nondescript office where a man named Elias was waiting. Elias wasn't a corporate shark. He was a specialist in forensic litigation, a man who dealt in the kind of justice that didn't just win cases, it erased legacies. I handed him the drive. I told him I didn't want a settlement. I didn't want an apology. I wanted the kind of revelation that would turn their Christmas champagne into vinegar. We worked through the night, the glow of the monitors the only light in the room as the rest of the city slept, in anticipation of Santa's arrival. We charted the flow of embezzled funds, the offshore accounts tied to Chloe's consulting fees, and the systematic erasure of pension funds that belonged to the very people Marcus was currently toasting at his pre-Christmas bash. The evidence was breathtaking in its cruelty. It wasn't just corporate greed. It was a sociopathic disregard for human life. And Marcus had left his fingerprints on every single file. By the morning of December 24th, the trap was set. While Marcus and Chloe were likely waking up in their penthouses, surrounded by mountains of wrapped gifts bought with stolen money, I was finalizing the delivery. This wasn't going to be a quiet legal filing handled by mail. No, I wanted them to feel the weight of their sins while they were at their most vulnerable, surrounded by the high society they so desperately craved. I knew where they would be. Every Christmas Eve, the Thorne family hosted the Silver and Gold Gala at the Pierre Hotel. It was a televised event, a display of opulence where they played the roles of grand philanthropists. They would be there, wearing their finest silks and diamonds, basking in the adoration of a city that didn't know they were vultures. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, focused adrenaline. I spent the afternoon at a high-end boutique, using the very last of my savings to buy a gown the color of midnight. If I was going to serve them their downfall, I was going to do it looking like the nightmare they never saw coming. As evening fell, the city transformed into a wonderland of light and sound. The bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral rang out, a call to worship and peace. But I was on a different kind of mission. I arrived at the Pierre Hotel just as the red carpet was being rolled out. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted chestnuts. I watched from the shadows as Marcus stepped out of his limousine, waving to the cameras with a practiced, benevolent smile. Chloe followed, draped in white fox fur, looking like a literal ice queen. They looked untouchable. They looked like gods. I waited until the ballroom was full, until the first toast had been made, and the orchestra was playing a sweeping rendition of Silent Night. I walked toward the entrance, the legal documents tucked into a sleek black portfolio that looked like nothing more than a sophisticated accessory. The security guards, distracted by the VIP arrivals, barely glanced at me as I slipped inside. The room was a sea of gold and white, a blinding display of wealth built on a foundation of lies. I saw them at the head table, laughing with the mayor and the city's elite. They looked so happy. They looked so safe. They had no idea that the woman they had discarded like trash 2 days ago was standing in the doorway, holding the match that would burn their entire world to the ground. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a reckoning. And it was the best Christmas gift I could ever give myself. I took a deep breath, adjusted the silk of my dress, and began my walk across the floor, every step a heartbeat, every second bringing me closer to the moment the mask would finally slip. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a cavern of shimmering decadence, a space where the air itself seemed to taste like expensive vintage and unearned confidence. As I moved through the crowd, the clinking of crystal glasses felt like a countdown. I watched Marcus Thorne from a distance, observing the way he leaned into conversations, his hand resting patronizingly on the shoulders of younger executives. He was the king of this artificial winter, a man who believed that power was a permanent birthright rather than a temporary loan. Chloe sat beside him, her laughter echoing above the soft strings of the quartet, her fingers tracing the rim of a flute that cost more than a month of my rent. They were celebrating their most profitable year, a milestone achieved by carving out the soul of the company and discarding the people who actually did the work. They hadn't even noticed me yet. To them, I had already been erased, a ghost of a corporate past that they had successfully exorcised on the 23rd. I moved with a predatory stillness, weaving through the elite of Manhattan. I saw the faces of people I had once respected, people who were now nodding along to Marcus's lies about corporate integrity and holiday spirit. The irony was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it down, letting it fuel the fire in my gut. My plan was not just about the legal papers in my hand, it was about the timing. In less than an hour, Marcus would take the stage for his annual Christmas keynote, a speech that was broadcast to every satellite office and shared across the industry's social media platforms. He wanted the world to see his triumph. I was going to make sure they saw his execution. I retreated to a dark corner near the tech booth, where a young AV technician was frantically checking cables. He looked stressed, overwhelmed by the scale of the production. I offered him a sympathetic smile and a cup of coffee I'd intercepted from a tray. And while he was distracted, I did what 5 years of high-level administrative access had trained me to do. I bypassed the security on his terminal. The digital architecture of the Thorne Empire was something I knew better than my own home. Within minutes, I had linked the forensic files Elias and I had compiled to the main projector feed. I set a silent trigger, When Marcus hit the final slide of his presentation, the one usually reserved for a Happy Holidays graphic, the world wouldn't see a digital Christmas card. They would see the ledger. They would see the scanned images of the forged signatures. They would see the wire transfer receipts to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, clearly labeled with Marcus and Chloe's private initials. My heart was thumping so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, but my hands remained steady. This was the meticulous craftsmanship of a woman who had been pushed too far. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the architect of their ruin, and the blueprints were already being uploaded to the cloud. I stepped back into the light, my midnight blue dress flowing behind me like a shadow. I made my way toward the front of the room, positioning myself near the edge of the stage. Suddenly, Chloe's eyes caught mine. The glass in her hand stopped mid-air. Her expression shifted from confusion to a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. He whispered something to Marcus, whose face darkened like a gathering storm. He signaled to his private security, two men who looked like they belonged in a boxing ring rather than a ballroom. They began to move toward me, their expressions grim, but I didn't run. I didn't flinch. I waited until they were only a few feet away. Then I stepped directly into the path of a roving camera crew that was filming the event for a live Business Leaders of the Year segment. I smiled at the camera, a cold, serene expression that forced the security guards to hesitate. They couldn't drag me out in front of a live lens without causing the very scene Marcus was trying to avoid. Marcus, seeing the camera, forced his features into a mask of fake warmth. He stepped forward, trying to intercept me before I could speak. He reached out to grab my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise, his voice a low, vibrating hiss. He told me that I was making a pathetic mistake, that I was a disgruntled nobody who was about to lose everything in a defamation suit. He threatened to blackball me from every firm in the country, to make sure I never worked again, even as a janitor. He called me a little girl who didn't understand how the world of adults worked. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel the need to look away. I leaned in, my breath brushing his ear, and told him that the little girl had kept the receipts. His grip tightened for a second, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his eyes, before he masked it with a laugh and pushed me toward the exit, signaling his men to finish the job quietly. But it was too late. The master of ceremonies was already announcing his name. The lights dimmed, and the spotlight swung to the center of the stage. Marcus had no choice but to release me and put on his show. He smoothed his tuxedo, plastered on his billionaire smile, and walked up the stairs to thunderous applause. I stood in the wings, just out of sight, watching him bask in the glory he had stolen from others. He began his speech, talking about vision, sacrifice, and the importance of family during the holiday season. Every word out of his mouth was a fresh insult to the hundreds of employees he had laid off to inflate his margins. Beside the stage, Chloe was watching me, her eyes narrow and hateful, mouthing the word loser as she sipped her champagne. She thought they had won. She thought the security guards waiting behind me were the end of my story. She didn't realize they were just the witnesses to hers. As Marcus reached the climax of his speech, his voice rising with theatrical emotion, he gestured toward the massive screen behind him. "And so," he boomed, his arms wide as if to embrace the entire city, "as we look toward a prosperous new year, let us remember what truly matters, the legacy we leave behind." He clicked the remote in his hand, expecting to see the Thorne Enterprises logo glowing in gold. Instead, the screen flickered, turned a jarring, clinical white, and then began to scroll through the special expenses ledger. The room went silent. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crowd witnessing a car crash in slow motion. The first document appeared, a wire transfer for $3 million, dated the same day the company's pension fund had been recalculated. Marcus's name was at the bottom, highlighted in a glowing digital red. He froze. He clicked the remote again and again, his face turning a sickly shade of gray under the stage lights. But the slides kept coming. Next came the email chain where Chloe joked about firing the low-level drones to pay for her summer estate in Tuscany. The audio began to play over the ballroom speakers, a recording I had made weeks ago of Marcus explaining exactly how he intended to frame me for the missing funds if the auditors ever got too close. His own voice filled the hall, cold and calculating, stripping away the veneer of the benevolent CEO to reveal the predator underneath. The guests began to murmur, then to whisper, and then to gasp as the sheer scale of the fraud was laid bare. Chloe dropped her glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound a sharp punctuation mark to the end of their reign. I stood in the shadows, the legal portfolio heavy in my hand, watching the color drain from their lives as the silver and gold gala turned into the scene of a public execution. The atmosphere in the ballroom curdled instantly. The festive warmth was replaced by a clinical, terrifying cold, as the guests, some of the most powerful people in the country, realized they were witnessing a monumental downfall in real time. Marcus Thorne stood frozen in the center of the spotlight, his mouth agape, looking like a man who had walked off a cliff and hadn't yet realized the ground was gone. On the screen behind him, the evidence continued to scroll like a digital guillotine. The offshore account numbers, the diverted tax filings, and finally, the termination notice he had signed for me on December 23rd, juxtaposed with a memo approving a 7-figure holiday bonus for himself and Chloe that same afternoon. The juxtaposition was so cruel, so undeniably greedy, that a low hiss of disapproval began to rise from the tables. These were people who understood the ruthlessness of business. But this was something else entirely. This was a betrayal of the very foundation of their social contract. I stepped out from the wings and walked onto the stage. The movement was deliberate, my heels clicking against the wood with a sound like a gavel. The cameras, sensing the shift in the narrative, pivoted away from Marcus and focused on me. I didn't look like the disgruntled nobody he had tried to paint me as. I looked like the personification of a debt that had finally come due. I walked straight to the podium, and for a second Marcus tried to block me, his hands shaking, his face a mask of sweating, desperate rage. He tried to grab the microphone, but I simply looked at him, a look of such absolute, icy authority that he involuntarily recoiled. I leaned into the mic, my voice calm and resonant, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. I told them that while Marcus Thorne was busy talking about family and legacy, he was actively robbing the families of the very people who built his empire. I announced that the documents on the screen had already been transmitted to the district attorney's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission as of 10 minutes ago. The room erupted. In the front row, I saw Chloe trying to flee, her white fox fur snagging on a chair as she stumbled toward the exit. But the doors were already being held, not by Marcus's security, but by officers in plain clothes who had been waiting for my signal. The look of pure animalistic terror on her face was the only Christmas gift I needed. She had spent her life treating people like disposable tools, and now she was being treated like a common criminal. I turned my attention back to Marcus. He was whispering, begging me to stop, offering me millions, promising me a seat on the board, anything to kill the feed. I simply opened the black portfolio I had been carrying and pulled out the physical lawsuit. I didn't hand it to him. I dropped it at his feet, right there on the stage, in front of the live cameras and the most influential eyes in New York. I told him, loud enough for the microphone to catch every syllable, "Merry Christmas, Marcus. Consider this my final contribution to the firm." The timing was poetic. As the legal papers hit the floor, the first sirens could be heard outside the hotel, wailing through the snowy night. The silver and gold gala was no longer a party. It was a crime scene. The journalists in the room were already typing furiously on their phones. The story of the Christmas Eve coup breaking across every major news outlet before the first course of dinner could even be served. I watched as the two plainclothes officers climbed the stairs to the stage. They didn't show Marcus the respect he thought he was owed. They didn't care about his tuxedo or his title. They read him his rights while he stood there, his knees buckling, the golden Thorne Enterprises logo on the screen behind him finally flickering out and being replaced by a simple, stark message: accountability. As they led him away in handcuffs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The silence was absolute. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with a hollow, pathetic realization. He had thought I was a pawn he could discard when the game got complicated. He never realized I was the one who had written the rules. I watched him being marched out into the cold December air, the same air he had thrown me into just 48 hours prior. Chloe followed shortly after, her designer heels clicking frantically on the marble as she was escorted out, her screams of, "Do you know who I am?" falling on deaf ears. The city's elite looked on with a mixture of horror and fascination, realizing that the hierarchy they lived by had just been permanently inverted. The power didn't belong to the man with the name on the building. It belonged to the person who held the truth. I walked off the stage and through the ballroom, my head held high. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to touch my arm, their faces filled with a new, terrified respect. I ignored them all. I didn't want their validation now that I was the one holding the cards. I walked out of the Pierre Hotel and onto the sidewalk where the snow was still falling, thick and beautiful. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cars reflected off the white drifts, creating a strange, festive glow of justice. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The 5 years of being overlooked, the months of documenting their crimes in secret, the sting of being fired 2 days before Christmas, it was all gone, replaced by a profound, quiet peace. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone vibrate. It was a message from Elias. "It's done. The freeze on their assets is total. You're free." I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp, cold air of Christmas Eve. The church bells were ringing again, but this time they sounded like a victory march. I had lost my job, my title, and my security, but I had gained something much more valuable: my soul. I looked up at the stars peeking through the New York clouds and smiled. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about the whims of a tyrant or the cruelty of a spoiled heiress. I had served them a lawsuit that would dismantle their lives piece by piece, and in doing so, I had built a new one for myself. I turned away from the hotel, leaving the chaos and the sirens behind me, and began to walk home through the quiet, snowy streets. The world was cold, but I was warm. The year was ending, but for me, everything was just beginning. The victim was gone, and in her place stood the woman who had brought an empire to its knees with nothing but the truth and a midnight blue dress. It was the most wonderful time of the year.